Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a big welcome to today's Train for Hiking live Q&A. Now, if you haven't come across me before or haven't come across these live streams before, my name is Rowan Smith. I'm the founder of Summit Strength, and essentially I specialize in helping hikers get fit, strong, and resilient for their adventures. Now, what these streams are all about is basically an open Q&A in regards to training or hiking. So today we should hopefully be running on both YouTube and also in our Facebook community. And hopefully both of the streams are working okay. So if anyone does have any questions they had about training for hiking, any topics they want to learn about, anything like that, feel free to just pop them in the chat. I'm always happy to help. Now, on top of that, I also do have a few questions that have been sent through prior to this, which I want to cover in a little bit of detail today. And then typically on the usual streams is in amongst all the questions, I also am doing a little bit of open course creation, where basically I'm just doing a bit of course creation about around a new breathing training for hikers course, which I'm putting together and just giving you a little bit of inside look in regards to how it is all going through. So as we're going through, anyone who's watching this live, please feel free to just pop a question in the chat, and I'm always happy to help. So with that being said, I do have a few questions that have been sent through prior, which I want to sort of cover. So we'll get into it right now. Now, the first topic I wanted to cover today is off-feet options for hikers. And essentially, basically, this is a really common situation, a very common topic that's very necessary for people who might be struggling with foot issues or shin issues or ankle issues or whatever it may be. And essentially, the question we sort of got here is, I've been told by my specialist that I have to avoid hiking and walking for the next 3 or 4 weeks. They've told me they want me to completely just minimize that. I can do other training, but they don't want me walking. But the tricky thing is, I actually have a big hike coming up in 16 weeks, and I'm worried about not being ready. What can I do here? This is a really common situation that a lot of hikers fall into, particularly if they're dealing with things like plantar fasciitis or shin splints or whatever it may be. And realistically, this is a big problem because a lot of hikers struggle with this, and it can be a really stressful situation because technically you've got to listen to your specialist, and your specialist is telling you to stay off your feet for one reason or another because they've got a plan for you for your healing, for your recovery, and all of that. On the flip side of things, basically, when we're looking at when we're looking at and all of that when we're looking at preparing for a hike, we do still want to be making sure that we are ready for this hike. We still want to make sure we're building up to it because the worst thing we can do is if we've only got 16 weeks and got 4 or 3 months leading into a trip, we don't want to be completely underprepared because number one, that can stress us out, that can get in the way of us enjoying the trip itself. But also number two, it just can be just end up putting you at a risk of re-aggravating things, which we do not want. So essentially what we want to be looking at here is just getting a nice balance between giving your feet the rest it needs and the rest it wants, and also making sure that you are, moving up. So realistically, what we want to look at here is a bit of an intentional process. Now, what I typically recommend is number one, the first thing we want to do if we're in this situation where we've got a big trip coming up, we're a little bit restricted from walking, whatever it may be, first thing we do, we want to chart out a little bit of a plan of attack in regards to returning to your walking and your hiking. So right now, in the next 3 or 4 weeks, you may not be able to do it, but once you are actually cleared for it, and you want to sort of look at, okay, in 4 weeks' time, I can go out hiking again. In 16 weeks' time, I have a big trip coming up. How am I going to approach this? And essentially just sitting down and penciling out a plan which will slowly but surely build you up between when you can walk and your trip is very important. Now, a few important considerations when you're looking at this. A lot of hikers are tempted if they've had a bit of time off, if they haven't been doing so much, and they're like, hey, I've got this trip coming up, they just jump straight in the deep end. They're like, hey, I'm going to start carrying a pack again, I'm going to start doing long hikes or whatever it may be, because they're a little bit worried, a little bit stressed. Realistically, what you want to be aiming for this type of situation is you want to be making sure you're having the slowest possible build to get you where you need to be when you're cleared. So it's not getting ready early, but it's the slowest possible build. So what I mean by that is ideally, if you've got a sit trip coming up in 16 weeks and you've got to be ready for a certain amount of hiking, a certain amount of pack weight, you realistically only build up to your max pack weight about 2 weeks before you go. And in between now and then, you slowly but surely build it up really slowly. Very, very important. Now, on top of that, in the meantime, off-peak conditioning is going to be your friend. If you're restricted by walking right now and you can't fit much in, we want to still be working cardiovascularly. We want to still be working, making sure we're moving our aerobic energy system forward, but we want to be respecting the recommendations from our professional about not going on the feet. So essentially, off-peak conditioning is your solution. Basically, choosing cardio options, which you can sustain for long periods of times to work on your aerobic fitness, but they don't put pressure through the feet. So this might be the stationary bike, the elliptical, the rower, this might be swimming or whatever it may be. Essentially, you want to be fitting as much of this as you can in while you're restricted from your walking. Both as a lower intensity stuff, but then also a slightly higher intensity. You can do interval stuff on this as well and get the combination there. That is where you want to be spending the majority of your time during this healing process because you can get a lot of good benefits of that while you are still restricted from your feet. Now, step number 3 is basically we want to look at strengthening. So if you're dealing with some type of limitation, strength is still going to be important, still going to be really, really valuable. However, we need to be smart about this. If you can still do normal strengthening, and if you can still go in the gym or still do your normal sessions, then lean into that. Do that 2 or 3 times a week. Really build out your strength during this time where you can. If you're in the situation where you can't actually do strength training, specifically some exercises are going to stress out your feet, then you just need to be creative. You just need to look at exercises and say, okay, this exercise I usually do to work certain muscles, but I cannot do this right now because of my feet. Have a think about how can I work that muscle group without putting stress through the feet. So in this situation, having a gym membership or a casual gym pass can make things a lot easier because if you are restricted from, say, squatting and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't squat because of my feet, maybe you can go in the gym and just do a leg extension machine. It's still going to work the quadriceps, but no pressure through the feet. Or the same thing, maybe you're doing single-legged deadlifts and you can't do these. Maybe I'm going to go to the gym and do some hamstring curls. You can get a lot of options and creative options at home to work around your feet if you're not training in a gym, but the gym environment makes things a little bit easier. But either way, you just want to think about what was I working on before, what can't I do, and what can I replace it with something that will give me a similar result but won't actually stress out the feet. And then finally, return to training. You just want to make sure that the specialist does give you a return to training plan. So if you're talking to a physio or a podiatrist or a specialist or whatever it may be, and they've told you 3 to 4 weeks of no walking or hiking, that's fine. But basically just make sure you have a conversation with them and say, how can I rebuild this when I get back to hiking? How can I rebuild this as I get back into things? Make sure they just don't sort of end up just saying, hey, you're clear for every normal exercise, go out and do things, because you want a bit of direction here. And if they don't give you a bit of direction, or their plan is just really underwhelming and you're like, hey, that's nowhere near where I need to be, then you may want to reach out for a bit of extra help. So when it comes down to this type of situation, relatively common. A lot of hikers do get restricted from the walking. Not ideal, but you can work around it. Make sure you do have a plan of attack. You know how you're going to re-enter your hiking afterwards. Make sure you are working on off-peak conditioning. Lean into that. It can be so valuable during this time. Lean into your strengthening, whether you can do normal strengthening or just adjust it around your feet, work around that, and then just make sure you do have a clear plan of attack in your return to hiking and training. Hopefully that helps for anyone who is falling into that situation. As I said, not ideal, but it does come up. So that's the first question out of the way. Anyone who is watching this on live, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook or whatever it may be, if you do have any questions you would like covered today, anything related for training for hiking, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm always happy to talk through whatever you may like. Now, with that being said, while we're waiting, let's move into the second topic that I had sent through. And we're talking about progressing strength exercises. So essentially, this particular question was sort of coming from someone. They were just basically asking, how can I make a strength exercise harder if I don't have more weight to train? And this is, again, a pretty common situation where people comes. Because when it comes down to strength development, strength training, really, really valuable for hikers. We know that. And when it comes down to strength training, progressive overload is key, meaning the body will get used to things relatively quickly. In order to keep on improving our strength and improving our endurance and improving our results, we want to progressively overload it, progressively give more challenge, more stimulus, so we'll keep on getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So whenever we're looking at strength training, we want to think about progressive overload. And one simple answer to that is just adding weights. As you get stronger, you can just do a little extra weight. You could do a little extra weight, do a little extra weight. And you can keep on building up weight for a long time, and that can be pretty effective. But for strength training, that could work pretty well. However, this doesn't work for everyone. A lot of hikers out there are a little bit limited on this. A lot of hikers out there, they don't particularly love the gym environment, so they're just doing their strength training at home, which is perfectly fine, and you can absolutely get you where you need to be. But there may be a situation where you've only got a limit of weights. Maybe you've only got a certain dumbbells, and you're like, well, do I really want to spend this money buying more and more heavy weights? Fair enough if you don't. Or there may be a situation where you're doing an exercise and you may only have a few dumbbells. You may have 5 kilos and 7 kilos and 10 kilos or something like that. And you may do an exercise with 5 kilos and you're like, that's too easy. But then you jump up to 7 kilos and you're like, that's actually way too hard. And there's just too big a jump up, which can happen. And that definitely falls into that situation. Another situation is a lot of hikers out there maybe just not be confident with heavy weights, which again is fair enough. Some people maybe don't have a huge amount of experience with this stuff. They're just not super confident. Always comes up. So in this situation, a lot of hikers fall into it. Now, if you're at this situation where you're like, I need to improve, I don't want to keep on improving weights. The first thing a lot of people look at is just adding reps. So maybe they say I do 10 reps one week, 11 reps the other week, 12 reps the next week, and keep on building up. This can be okay for maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 weeks, but realistically, it's not something you want to do long term because, this will see improvements temporarily, but it will stagnate after a few weeks in regards to you won't really feel like you can do more and more reps. It doesn't really, it doesn't scale very well. And also on top of that, it can change the emphasis of an exercise. The amount of resistance we're putting into an exercise and the amount of repetitions we can do will change the focus of an exercise. For example, if you're doing an exercise where you can only really do 8 repetitions before you get tired, versus if you can do 15 repetitions, there's slightly different emphasis, and we don't really want that. So if you just keep on adding extra reps, it may not be the best approach. So with all that being said, let's talk about the solution. Because realistically, when it comes down to it, progressive overload we want to be looking at. We want to be making sure we are building things up and making it harder. But to be clear, there are many, many, many different ways you can progress an exercise, which doesn't actually involve you adding weights, doesn't actually involve you adding reps. There's lots of things you can choose from. A few simple examples. If you were doing the same exercise, say you're doing squats and you're like, hey, I want to make this a little bit harder. You can keep the exact same exercise, but you could just add a little bit extra range of motion, meaning you just go down a little bit further. You may do 3 weeks of going to a certain point. You're like, yep, I'm feeling good. And then 3 weeks where we just go a little bit deeper. That can work out really well. Another option is doing a slower eccentric or a slower lowering portion of the exercise. So again, in the squat example, you may do 3 weeks of just going down for 2 or 3 seconds with your squat, then coming up to the top, and then going down for 2 to 3 seconds, then coming up to the top. And then you're like, hey, that's a little bit easy for me. So what I could do for the next 2 or 3 weeks is I could aim for 4 seconds on the way down. And you could count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then up, and then do that each time. You will notice that is significantly more difficult. Or another option is just adding pauses. If you, again, on the squat example, you could sort of say at the hardest part of the movement, maybe I'm going to add a little pause. So each time I go down at the bottom position, maybe I'm going to pause for 1 or 2 seconds before I go up. All of those things are perfectly legitimate methods of progression, and that can work out pretty well. So to give you some sort of visual context, we could sort of use this example of, a bodyweight box squat. And maybe we just imagine you're holding a dumbbell at your chest. In this situation, we're coming up and down, basically just coming off this chair, relatively small range of motion, and, all mass control. That's a simple version of your squat. Then you say, hey, maybe I want to progress this a little bit more. Then we could do something like this, where in this particular example, we're doing 2 things that are a little bit harder. Number one, we've got a slower lowering, so you can count this as like 6 seconds on the way down. Very, very slow, definitely works. And you can also see this is a bit of an extra range of motion, so we're actually getting a little bit deeper. So that works out really well for progression. The exact same exercise, but just different ways of making things a little bit harder. Now, the other examples of this is this could be exactly the same exercise. Another example when it comes down to things is you could potentially look at using just a different exercise variation. So you could just basically tweak the exercise very, very slightly to make it a little bit more difficult. One simple way you could sort of look at this is changing where you hold your weights. A lot of people don't really think about this, but this can be pretty significantly more difficult. So, for example, like should go from holding weights and dumbbells at your side to holding a dumbbell at your chest. So the first example, maybe you could do this exercise where you're holding dumbbells in your hands. You got them just hanging down by your hips. You may do that for 3 or 4 weeks. Then you're like, I want to make this a bit harder. Then we may go to this goblet version where we hold the weight up at our chest. And you'll probably notice that's actually a little bit more difficult. And that can be a perfectly legitimate method of progression. Or another option is you could use a harder version of the same movement. You could keep the same exercise, same movement pattern, but just make it a little bit harder. So, for example, we could use split squats as an example. Great exercise for hikers, coming straight down, straight up, working through this, works out very, very well. And then you may say, I want to make this a little bit harder. You can move into like a Bulgarian split squat, where we've got one leg up on a chair and we're pushing up and down. Still the same sort of movement pattern, but it's just a slightly harder variation. So there's lots and lots of different ways you can kind of progress things. So to put this all into context in regards to how you may actually use this when it comes down to your training, you could sort of look at a bit of a longer term plan. And you could sort of say, hey, how am I actually going to use this over the months? Now, there's a million and one ways you can go about this, but to give you a really, really simple example, you may sort of say, when I'm going about my strength training, I'm going to keep the same exercise for 3 to 4 weeks. I'm going to do the same exercise for 3 to 4 weeks, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make it a little bit harder each week. So each week I do it, I'm basically just going to either add a little extra weight, or I'm going to add a little extra range of motion, or some slower lowering, or whatever it may be. You repeat it for 3 to 4 weeks, and each week just make it a little bit harder, whatever it may be. And then the next 3 to 4 weeks, you just choose a harder variation. So you take what you were doing, make it slightly harder, and just do a slightly different variation. And then again, week by week by week, we just make it a little bit harder. And you do this for 3 to 4 weeks, and then you can basically do another harder variation or do an exercise altogether. So to just put this into full context, phase one, we might say goblet squat. Phase two, might sort of say, let's sort of say maybe a barbell squat. Phase three might be a split squat. So in this situation, we've done a goblet squat for 4 weeks. We made it a little bit harder for 4 weeks with a barbell squat. And then we're like, hey, we just want to do a different exercise altogether. Maybe we'll go to a split squat. That's 12 weeks of training. And realistically, that works out really, really well. So long story short, when it comes down to making an exercise harder without weight, there are so many options out there available for you. You just need to get a little creative. You can sort of figure whatever out you want, and it works out pretty well. So moving forward, as I always say, anyone watching this live on YouTube or Facebook, if you do have any questions you would like covered, pop it in the chat. More than happy to answer anything as I'm going through. Next topic I wanted to cover today is training twice in a day. And this is a subject that's come up quite a few times actually in the last sort of month, and I definitely wanted to cover it today. And basically the question was, look, because of my schedule, I'm going to have to fit in 2 sessions in a day this week. Is this okay? And this is a really, really common thing because a lot of people will sort of say, hey, I have a normal schedule. And during the week, I'll train 4 days in a week or 5 days in a week or whatever it may be. But sometimes you'll have family visiting, or sometimes you'll go on holidays, or sometimes the weather just won't be amazing or whatever it may be. And you're like, you know what? I just do not have a clear run of training. I still want to fit everything in. Maybe I have to squeeze it all in one day. And realistically, when it comes down to this type of situation, it is absolutely totally fine if you need to train twice in a day. A lot of people think, hey, this is too much. A lot of people think, hey, it's just going to overload the body. It is perfectly fine as long as you're smart about it. It may not be ideal or optimal, in regards to energy, because, if you're training twice in a day, probably your second session, you're going to be a little bit tired, as it comes down. But realistically, when we're approaching our training, typically we want to look at practical over optimal. In the sense, in the perfect world, yeah, you would sort of have your sessions broken out. But if it's just more practical to fit 2 in a day, totally fine. And realistically, if it is going to cause you more stress trying to break them up in a week, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to wake up at 5 a.m. before my family arrives and fit something in or whatever it may be, it's just not worth it. If it's more convenient, you do two sessions in a day, totally fine. If this is just a once in a while thing, and you're like, hey, this just comes up occasionally, whatever it may be, a few simple rules for this. Number one, I would usually say do your harder session first. So if you're training twice in a day and you've got one session which is very, very difficult, and one session that's a little bit easier, do the harder one first. So you're fresh, so you've got the energy, so you can concentrate on that. Typically where you want to go. On top of that, let's just make sure you do eat something in between. A lot of people will do these double sessions, whether it's morning and evening, or whether it's morning and afternoon, or whether it's right after the other. And they'll just not eat anything. And we don't want that. We want to make sure you are fueling. So realistically, if you are training morning, afternoon, or morning, evening, make sure there is a full meal in there somewhere. If you are training 60 minutes and then immediately another 60 minutes and squeezing things into 2, make sure you do have something in between and have some type of like carbohydrate snack, a piece of fruit, some toast, something like that, just to give you a little bit of replenishment of energy. It does really go a long way. And no matter what second session you're entering, whether it's back to back or further in the day, make sure you're going in fully hydrated. So making sure you are drinking water through your sessions, making sure you are hydrated, it does go a long way in regards to energy. Now, if you're not sure how to figure out your hydration, simplest thing, go to the toilet. You can do this midway through a session, or you can do this whatever it may be. Look at your urine color. Ideally, we're looking at clear to straw colored urine. If it's clear to straw colored, happy days. That's kind of where we want to be. If it's not, then drink a bit of water. Should be good. Should be all good. And then also on top of that, just be nice to yourself and accept that the second session probably isn't going to be as good as you usually do. If you already trained that day, energy is going to be a little bit lower. Realistically, it's not going to be quite as good. But just give yourself grace here. As long as you accept that, you go into the session being aware of that, that goes a long way. As opposed to walking into the session, you're like, yep, you know what, I'm going to train exactly how I usually do. And then you end up being disappointed, you start beating yourself up. We don't want that. Accept it, acknowledge it, be nice to yourself. Alternatively, if this is a more regular thing, so those tips are like if it's just once in a while, like your family's visiting or the weather's no good or whatever it may be. If this is a regular thing and you're like, realistically, just in my schedule, I kind of want to fit in all these sessions, but I have to train twice in a day all the time. Again, it's doable, it's fine. Typical things I would recommend is still keep on that. Do the harder session, make sure you eat between, make sure you're hydrated and all of that. But on top of that, just probably try to avoid doing two higher intensity sessions in a day. So, higher intensity is probably your strength training, probably your interval training if you're doing kids sessions or whatever it may be. I would probably try to break the higher intensity stuff up once a day. And then if you're doing a second session, do something to look at lower intensity. Maybe a pack walking, maybe a casual hike, maybe like just a walking or a cycling session or whatever it may be. And then on top of that is if this is a regular thing, probably you just want to decide what time of day do you have more energy? Do you have more energy in the morning, the afternoon, or the evening? And when am I planning to train? The morning, the afternoon, or the evening? And then whenever you typically have the most energy, do that. Do the harder session then. So, for example, if you were in a situation where you're like, hey, I have the most energy in the afternoon and I'm going to do a strength and a pack walk, maybe do the pack walk in the morning and then the strength in the afternoon. Or if you're like, I have the most energy in the morning, do the opposite or whatever it may be. Just so that everyone will be a little bit different there, but that's what I typically recommend. Last things I want to sort of say on this topic before I wrap this one up is, you don't have to be doing double sessions. Sometimes people will look at this like, oh my gosh, I'm training for a trip. I feel like I'm doing enough, but are people doing double sessions? Should I be doing more? Whatever it may be. Just know you don't have to be doing this. I don't feel pressured if you are. But because, if you do need to do this, it can be perfectly fine. And because hiking involves a large spread of different, what we call modalities, so it's not just a high intensity thing. It's not just a low intensity thing. There's a lot of different stuff we want to fit in there. We can spread this out through the week pretty well, and we can manage this pretty well. So if you are training twice a day, hopefully that helps. Now, that's enough on that sort of subject there. As I say, for anyone watching on live or YouTube or Facebook, feel free, if you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, pop a comment in the chat. Happy to help. Or if you just want to say hello, let me know where you're from or where you're hiking from. Pop it in. Always happy to have a chat. Now, the last question that I kind of had sent through, which I want to cover, want to cover, and then obviously if anyone else posts up, I'm happy to go through that. But the last question I wanted to touch on today was low energy. And this is really, really relevant for many, many hikers out there. So many people fall into it. And the question was, I'm currently going through a big training journey. And this in particular situation, the person had a big trip coming up. And they sort of said, look, I've been experiencing periods of low energy. I'm working through, I'm doing lots of training, but I am going down on energy. I'm working with a specialist to help me with that because it is, a few things going on. But in the meantime, while I'm figuring out my energy and its highs and lows and getting them under control, how can I approach my training? Again, really, really common thing, particularly if we are stepping into a big training process, we're doing lots of stuff, we can obviously end up with low energy, pretty common. On top of that, a lot of people may be going through simultaneously trying to lose some weight. A lot of hikers do that, and that can affect energy. Then we have medical things, then we have nutrition things, and there's a bunch of other stuff that can go on with energy. So lots and lots of different things. Realistically, if you are aware that your energy is a little bit up and down at certain times, and you're going through a training plan, the worst thing you can do is just ignore it. The worst thing you can do is just do the whole go hard, go home, just push through your low energy and just deal with it. I do not recommend that because, yeah, you can do that for a week or two or whatever it may be. But it's not a long-term solution. You want to respect your body. You want to be nice to your body. You want to work around it. So when it comes down to this, and if you're a little bit up or down in energy, a few different options available for you, depending on what you may prefer. Now, option number one, you may be like, you know what, I'm going through lots of low energy. Maybe what I'm doing with my training right now, I was super, super ambitious. I'm fitting in all of these sessions. But realistically, maybe it is just a little bit too much. Maybe I bit off a little bit more than I can chew. Maybe I just need to reduce things down. In option number one, there is always the possibility you could reduce your training volume. So go from training 5 days a week down to 4 days a week, or going from doing 60-minute sessions down to 45-minute sessions, or whatever it may be. That is perfectly, perfectly, perfectly fine. Or reduce your intensity down a little bit. If you're doing lots of high intensity stuff, maybe swap one of those sessions out for something a little bit easier. Or if you're doing strength training and really, really working hard, maybe just back off in the intensity a little bit. Sometimes little tweaks on this stuff can go a long, long way and help you find that baseline of energy a little bit more. Now, another option you could look at is if you like this, you could look at deload weeks. So basically a deload week is basically just having predetermined weeks which are a little bit lower intensity, a little bit easier where you're at. So it may be a case of sort of saying week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And this might be normal training. And you may say do 3 weeks of normal training where week by week by week you're making things a little bit hard. And then week 4 might be a deload week. You may sort of say hiking equals really short hike or no hike. Strength equals reduced weights. Cardio equals reduced speed. And it may be a case of this, and you may just sort of say, you know what, every 4th week, I'm going to just have a bit of a more of a casual week. Well, I'm just going to do either no hiking if I'm hiking every single week, or just do a short hike. If I'm doing strength, I'll still do the same strength session, but I'll make everything a little bit easier for myself. If I'm doing cardio, I'll just make it a little bit reduced. And then week 5, back to normal training. And that can work out pretty well, and a lot of people do use that. And then the third option that sort of comes down to this, and this is one I quite like a lot, is using a daily self-assessment. Because when it comes down to this type of stuff, if we are a little bit up and down on energy with a lot of different things, sometimes it can be hard to know when that low energy is going to strike. Sometimes it can be hard to know, like, when you're going to have good energy, when you're going to have bad energy. And sometimes the tricky thing when we're looking at option number 2 is sometimes these deload weeks, they can be good at sort of helping you over the long term, but sometimes this can sort of not line up quite well. And you may realize on week 4, actually, I've got plenty of energy. I'm feeling really good. And you may actually miss out on a week of really good training if you did a deload. Alternatively, you may end up having a really low energy week on week 2, and that may just be really uncomfortable if you need to push through it or whatever it may be. So option number 3, using a daily self-assessment, can be a really, really nice, flexible approach for this. And essentially what you're doing here is very, very, very simple. Every single day before you train, whether it's strength training, whether it's hiking, whether it's walking, cardio, anything like that, every single day before you train, you basically give yourself a score of between 1 to 3 in regard to energy. 3 is I'm super, super, super energetic. I'm feeling really good. I kind of got loads of energy today. A 2 is, you know what, I'm just normal energy. Not good, not bad, I'm just normal. 1, I'm low energy today. I'm not feeling amazing. Essentially, what you do is score yourself right before the session, and depending on your answer, depends on how you approach the session. If you score a 2, and if you're like, hey, I've got normal energy, then just do whatever session you're planning as normal. If you're doing strength training, if you're doing cardio, if you're doing hiking, just do whatever you originally planned. If you score 3 and you're like, you know what, I'm feeling really energetic today, then feel free to push the session a little bit more. On the strength, maybe try to do a bit extra weight or make it a little bit harder in one way. If you're hiking, maybe choose a harder challenge or use a bit extra pack weight or whatever it may be. Feel free to push it so you're taking advantage of that higher energy. Alternatively, if you score number 1, then you say, you know what, today I'm not feeling so good. I'm going to respect that. I know that that's how I feel. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce things down. So I can still get a session in. I can still keep this consistency, keep this routine, make sure I'm still doing something, but I'm going to respect my energy. Now, what I quite like to do here is do 50% of a session if you're not feeling great. So strength equals 50% of reps. Cardio equals 50% of volume. Hiking equals 50% of pack weight or So what that means is, for your strength session, if it was a strength session, you scored a 1, then you may look at your session and you say, you know what, for every single exercise, I'm going to do half the reps I usually do. So if I usually do 10 reps of an exercise, this week I'm just going to do 5. If I usually do 15 reps of something, this week I'm just going to do 7, or whatever it may be. So the idea behind it is you still go through your session, you still work through those exercises, you still got something in your calendar, but it's much nicer. For cardio, if you're doing pack walking or stair climbing or intervals, you just do half of the session. If you usually do 40 minutes, just do 20 minutes. If you usually do 10 intervals, just do 5 intervals, or whatever it may be. And if you're hiking, maybe you'll just do 50% of your pack weight. If you've been loading up your pack weight, just make it a little bit easier for yourself, or just cut it in half and say, look, I was planning on doing a 4-hour hike today. I'm not feeling amazing. I'm just going to do 2 hours, or whatever it is. I really like this because it kind of helps you work around the ups and downs of energy. You can take advantage of the good energy, it can work around the low energy, and just gives you a little bit of flexibility. And I quite like that. So if you are struggling with like going through a little bit of up and down energy, hopefully that gives you a few ideas to sort of work around that, and hopefully that can make a little bit of a difference. So with that being said, that's kind of all the questions I had sent through at this stage. Now, for anyone watching this live, if you did have any questions that you want to be covered today, feel free to plug it in chat. Happy to have a talk through absolutely anything. But usually at this stage of these calls, I would get into a little bit of open course creation, where I'm basically doing an open creation around my new breathing training for hikers course, where we're going into a specific subject around respiratory muscle training, which is also known as strength training for breathing. However, today I've literally been on calls and on Zoom for the last 5 or 6 hours, and my voice is about to go. So I might just sort of finish things up a little bit early today, with all that being said. So basically, the next live stream, I'm going to be doing these Tuesdays and Fridays ongoing for the next 5, 6 months. So if anyone does have any questions you would like covered on this, feel free to send me a message, send me an email, put it in the comments on your chat, or whatever it may be. I'm happy to cover it. But for anyone watching live, hope you learned some interesting stuff today. Hope you've enjoyed it. Anyone watching in the future, hope you get some good value out of all of this. But with that being said, I'm going to go rest my voice. Hope you have a lovely, lovely rest of your day, and we'll talk to you all very, very soon. Bye.